But Phil is a longtime activist, decades of work, of revolutionary work in the U.S. and really around the world. He is the editor of the Virginia Defender. He is the coordinator of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign. And also he is one of the main organizers for the United National Anti-War Coalition that's coming up in June. We'll talk about that in a moment. But Phil brings a wealth of information and the kind of international perspective that we have to have at this critical moment in the U.S. And so what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about Ukraine. We're going to look at, get an update on Odessa, and Phil will give you more information on that situation. And we're going to look at, what's happening really around the world and how these various issues sort of interconnect, because we have a very dangerous situation developing with the Trump administration, with the voices in the intelligence agencies and other parts of the state and in the corporate media that is seems to be bent on pushing for more confrontation with Russia, more confrontation with the Chinese, and a more aggressive campaign and political destabilization against all of the perceived states that are not playing ball with the U.S. empire. So thank you, Phil, for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
So Phil, let's get right into it, because we're going to have a conversation among ourselves, and then we're going to go to our viewers. The first thing I wanted to talk about was, with all of the things that we have been sort of looking at with the Trump administration over the first 100 days with Russia Gate, with the attack in Syria, with the saber rattling with North Korea. One of the issues that have not received the kind of attention I think that it should receive is what is the situation in Ukraine and the tensions that are still there. And what some people argue was at the first attempt or the first focus that the neocons had with the Trump administration to try to split the new Trump administration away from any attempt to patch up relations with the Russians, and that is with the issue in Ukraine. But they found, I guess, a juicier target with that whole argument around Trump campaign and Russia collusion. So give us, what is really happening in Ukraine, because we know that that situation is going to probably get more attention in the coming months.
Well, Ukraine was a socialist republic within the Soviet Union 26 years ago. And then after what Europeans call the transformation, the collapse of socialism, it became an independent country and moved to transform itself to a capitalist country. But it still had certain vestiges of socialism, certain state ownership of the economy, certain social benefits for the working class, and it wasn't as profitable a place for the West to invest in as they had hoped. So in 2014 there was a coup, and a president who was not, I wouldn't say so much sympathetic to Russia as looking to Russia for better trade relations than he thought the country could get with Western Europe, was overthrown as a result of mass street protests that became violent. More than 100 people were killed. That president fled the country, and a new one who was much more oriented towards the European Union and the U.S. Came to power. And the United States was up to its eyeballs in that coup. just not only the United States government, but nonprofits like the George Soros Open Society Foundation, which had been operating NGOs in Ukraine since before the transformation. And it all came together in 2014. And when that happened, of course, the Western commentators predicted that the country would move more to a free market economy, and that would usher in real democracy, and there would be prosperity for everyone, and bluebirds in the sky, and an apple pie on everybody's kitchen table. Mm-hmm. Well, what happened was the intensification of a process that began after the collapse of socialism, which was selling off the state-owned resources in fire sales to insiders who became oligarchs. And these oligarchs had their own political agendas, and in order to promote them, they sponsored paramilitary organizations that operate as well-funded thugs to crush opposition and promote programs. Well, this new government that came in 2014, one of the first things they did was try to outlaw the use of the Russian language. Now, Ukraine's a funny country in that it was late to come to a national identity. It's situated between Poland and Russia, and historically, you know, in the 19th century, had been buffeted between the two. The eastern part of the country was part of Russia, and Odessa, the city that we're talking about, is actually younger than Richmond, Virginia, where I live. It was set up by Catherine the Great in the late 1700s. So a right-wing government coming into power, anti-Russian, was seen as a great threat by people in the eastern part of the country who tended to be more open to the benefits that they had accrued as a result of socialism. So Crimea, in the southern part of the country, had a referendum and decided to separate from Ukraine altogether and petitioned to reunite with Russia, which had been conquered hundreds of years. And another area called the Donbass resisted what they saw a right-wing pro-fascist government, and anti-Russian, which they were largely ethnically, and there has been fighting ever since, and people have lost.
Let me jump in for a second, Phil, because I want to make sure that there's certain elements of that we make sure are clear, because you know the narrative is that you know you have the eastern part of Ukraine that ended up becoming so-called pro-Russian. But and we know that there was in fact an independence movement in that part of the country. But I think it's important to point out too that the dissatisfaction, the rebellion, if you will, that took place in that part of the country was a result of the fact that this was a part of the country that had voted very heavily for the disposed democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. And so that there was a response from that part of the country, but the response from the coup plotters was in fact repression. Now, I think I just wanted to make sure that was kind of put out there, because the narrative almost implies that from the very beginning there was this sort of military response on the part of the people in the eastern part of the Ukraine. So I just want to kind of throw that in.
Yeah, and further, the popular narrative is that Russia simply came in and took over Crimea and intervened in the fighting in Donbass and has designs on Ukraine itself. No, it was a reaction by a section of the country that had historically had ties with Russia and saw a right-wing government come to power in 2014 that was actively working with fascist neo-Nazi organizations and was trying to suppress the democratic rights of the Russian minority. Yeah, so it was a reaction to that. Odessa is a special situation because
But before we go to Odessa, and I want to concentrate on that for us in a minute. But before we go to Odessa specifically, I wanted to ask you, Phil, to comment on. Now you mentioned that part of the design on the part of some in the West was to open up the Ukrainian society for more direct capital penetration. We know that there's a movement on the part of many people in Ukraine to want to come closer to the EU. But we also know that if when we look at Ukraine and that struggle, that the kind of investment that was made by the U.S., some people say to the tune of billions of dollars, to undermine the democratic processes in that country, was motivated by various kinds of objectives. One, of course, was to open up the society, but it also was, many people argue, or I argue, it was also connected to leverage that the U.S. wanted to exert on Russia relating to the conflict in Syria.
well, it's hard to separate one thing from another.
Mhm.
When the International Monetary Fund comes to a country like Ukraine and offers loans because the economy is in bad shape, it comes with tremendous agenda of conditions, including reducing the pensions for retired workers.
Yeah.
And selling off state properties, deregulating industries, cutting back on all social programs. I mean, those three things, privatization, deregulation, and cutbacks in social programs, that's the Tea Party agenda.
Yes. Yeah.
That was the agenda of the Green Movement in Iran. That's the agenda of the opposition forces in Venezuela. That was the the objectives of the IMF in Ukraine. So that's an economic aspect. On the political aspect, if you really want to have a relationship with the Western banks in Europe, you join the European Union. A condition for joining the European Union is joining NATO.
Yeah.
So this means that as the Western banks and corporations penetrate further and further east towards Russia, they come with troops. They bring troops right up to the Russian border.
Mm-hmm.
So Trump comes in and he says some things. We want to reset the relationship with Russia. We don't want to be enemies and so on. And there was some confusion among leftists in Eastern Europe that maybe Trump wasn't that bad. Number one, he was only interested in his own economic benefits and that of his class. He thought maybe he could make more money being friendly with Russia. But presidents come and go. The ruling class moves from one administration to the next, and they said no. Attacking, promoting deregulation in the United States, attacking immigrants, attacking Muslims, that's all fine, but don't mess with NATO. Don't mess with NATO, because we use NATO to control things, and don't get friendly with Russia because we want Russia. We want a color revolution in Russia. We want to reduce Russia to a neo-colony. So, and I suspect that's what's ultimately behind some of the troubles that Trump is finding himself in today. It's not the specific problems he made, but he's messing up in relation to the ruling class. He's not following their script.
Mm-hmm.
And what is that script? It's the domination of the world.
Exactly.
Whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Africa, whether it's Latin America, and Russia is an obstacle to that. China is an obstacle to that. So they're going to do everything they can to undermine these countries, short of war.
Full spectrum dominance is the strategy, and every administration since the collapse of the Soviet Union has followed that. Before we go to questions, talk to us a little bit more, and more specifically, about a topic you're getting ready to go into, and that is Odessa.
Yeah, I wound up in Odessa last May, a year ago. After the coup in 2014, activists progressive activists in Odessa started a petition campaign.
Now, describe to us you started to a minute ago, Odessa in relationship to broader Ukraine.
Well, Odessa is a port city on the Black Sea in southern Ukraine. It's predominantly Ukrainian, but Russian is the dominant language. Almost 90% of the people speak Russian at home, even though the Russian ethnic group is a minority. It's always been a very cosmopolitan city, kind of laid back in its cultural norms, and it was not a place of a lot of political ferment until the coup. And then people saw, they're being ruled by a government which appoints their local governor. And their main goal was to move to a federal system like we have in the United States, where local governors can be elected so they would be a little more responsive to the people of Odessa and their needs. And there was a terrible clash between the pro-coup forces and the people promoting federalism on May 2nd, 2014. And a huge mob whipped up to a frenzy by neo-Nazi organizations chased the pro-federalist people into a 5-story union building and set it on fire. And 46 people died from flame, smoke inhalation, jumping from windows, being beaten as they landed on the ground. It's described as the worst civil conflict in Europe since World War II. And the families, members, relatives, supporters, and friends of those who died have never stopped demanding an international investigation of who was behind this massacre. And every week they go to the scene of the crime and they lay flowers and put down candles and say prayers and make speeches. And almost every week the fascists come out and harass them and attack them. So they had a big memorial on the first anniversary, which was attacked. And when the second memorial came, they asked for international observers to come and stand with them on the hope that maybe, like white folks who went down to Mississippi in '64, maybe the local police would be reluctant to attack folks. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I wound up in Odessa on May 2nd, 2016. We did a campaign to demand that the United States government and the Ukrainian government ensure that fascists would not attack that memorial in Odessa. And over 180 organizations in 46 countries signed on to a statement that was publicized. And then we went to Odessa, which was an amazing scene, a city locked down by an alliance between the fascists and a right-wing government. But the day came off well, because 3,000 to 4,000 Odessans came out and defied the opposition and had their memorial. But it's been very difficult since. The family members are organized as the Council of Mothers of May 2, and the organizers of that council have come under tremendous repression by the government and physical attacks by the fascists. When we came back from Odessa, there were 3 of us from UNAC, Bruce Gagnon from the Global Network Against Weapons and Military and Nuclear Weapons in Space, and Regis Tremblay, an independent videographer. And we formed the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, which is a project of the United National Anti-War Network. And you can find that on OdessaSolidarityCampaign.org. And we've been pumping out information about what's happening in Odessa since then, publicizing the ongoing repression. And on April 10th, which is the anniversary of the day that the Red Army and Ukrainian partisans drove the Nazis and Romanian fascists out of Odessa in 1943. 43. On that date, we called for an International Day of Solidarity with the people of Odessa. And we delivered a letter to the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C., addressed to President Petro Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, demanding the release of all political prisoners and an end to repression against the Council of Mothers and other relatives of those who died in 2014. That same letter was delivered to Ukrainian embassies and consulates in 20 cities in 13 countries. I think
That's
it was
very, very impressive.
largest
Very impressive.
coordinated support campaign ever carried out for Odessa. Friends in
Phil,
Odessa,
I'm gonna have to cut you off there, and we'll come back to this. I mean, it's very important and very interesting work. But we have a lot of folks who have questions, and our time is slipping by us. So hopefully you can maybe work in the rest of the work that you all are doing with the Odessa Solidarity campaign in some of your responses. But what we want to try to do, Phil, is to address some of these questions as quickly and concisely as possible, so we can try to get as many as we can in. I mean, you talked about the Odessa situation and the role of the fascists in that city. There are a lot of questions. John wants to know. John Lovell wants to know that since the coup, there appears to be a proliferation of neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, and he's wondering just how large the movement is in terms of the right wing in Ukraine.
Well, two of the groups, one called the Azov Battalion, which wears an insignia adopted from the Nazi SS units, another called Right Sector that played the role of paramilitary thugs in the actual coup in Kiev in 2014. They have been recruited by the Ukrainian government to fight in Donbass. Azov Battalion has been incorporated into the Ukrainian military with their insignias, the double lightning bolt, and the Right Sector has sent whole organized groupings into Donbass. So when we think of fascist organizations here, we think of the Klan or various white supremacist groups, but they're not as developed as they are in Ukraine. Ukraine, they can march and look exactly like the military with spanking new uniforms and equipment and weapons. It's a long ways from three Klansmen in a cornfield burning the cross. This is truly a Nazi-like operation. However, they can't control everything. They have not been able to subdue the movement, the anti-fascist movement in Odessa. And there are political pressures that can be brought on the Ukrainian government because the U.S. is trying to project it as a country struggling to develop real democracy according to what they define as democracy, and it's not happening. As much as the proliferation of neo-Nazi groups is a problem, the corruption is so endemic to the country that even the West is sometimes ready to throw up its hands.
But the right has a long history in that part of the world, correct? I mean, so it's not something that just sort of emerged out of thin air.
Well, when you see these folks come out on the streets in Ukraine, a lot of them are carrying a red and black flag. That is the flag of the movement of Stefan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian fascist who raised forces that collaborated with the Nazis and has been blamed for the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews, communists, and others during the Second World War. So you have to remember, in the Second World War, Ukraine was split between those who collaborated with the Nazis and those who fought against it. And those who fought against it worked with the Soviet Army, the Red Army. And those who fought on the side of the Nazis were organized as Ukrainian fascist organizations. So that indemnity continues down to the present time, and it's the background that the present day economic and political struggles play out against.
But Phil, so then the question becomes for some people is then why was it that the Obama administration, this administration that proclaims to be the champion of democracy and human rights, why would it throw its support behind a movement with those kinds of fascist elements at the center?
there is one U.S. policy. There is one U.S. international goal, and that's world domination, hegemony. And whether it's carried out in a reckless, clumsy way, the way George Bush tried to do in Iraq, whether it's carried out in the more sophisticated way that Barack Obama tried to promote, or whether, I don't know where Trump fits in it. I think the ruling class is seriously considering throwing him overboard because he's messing up so many situations for them. But Barack Obama had two faces. And there was a dual character to his presidency. He was the first black president. That was objectively an advance in the democratic rights of African American people. And naturally, a lot of people felt wonderful that there was a black man in the White House for the first time. However, he was still the president of the United States, which makes him the ruler of the American empire, and his job around the world was to promote the causes of U.S. corporations. He was the first black president, and he was the first president to openly bomb an African country, Libya, destroying it, the most economically advanced country in Africa, reduced to a failed state. He allowed or ordered the bombing of Somalia, of Sudan. Those are three African countries, not to mention Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. So
well, see, Phil, but that's what makes it so outrageous. The comments that the Obama administration made vis-a-vis the supposed interventions on the part of the Russians and the Russians' attempt to try to redraw boundaries in Europe. When you have you had situations around the world where the Obama administration was involved in doing the same things in Syria, but in particular, and you mentioned the country Sudan, where basically the Obama administration was responsible for, in fact, carving out a piece of that nation and creating a new nation state.
That's right. Which is now embroiled in a civil war.
Exactly.
So, it's folks who look to the Democratic Party as some kind of a bulwark against fascism in this country are seriously misjudging the situation. And last year I had the opportunity, which was pretty amazing, to go to Eastern Europe 4 times for conferences and for the memorial in Ukraine. And it was clear that what happened there was neoliberal governments had come to power after the transformation. They were creating trade deals with the West that benefited a small group of oligarchs and resulted in real poverty for the working people. As a result, there was the growth of nationalist populist organizations that promised some relief for the working class, but built their popularity on promoting the kind of America First program of Trump. Hungary for the Hungarians, Poland for the Polish, keep out all immigrants, and some benefits for the working class. So the workers had a choice between neoliberals, who were not as overtly racist as the right wing, but who were causing them tremendous economic hardship, and a right wing that was racist, but was promising some economic relief. That scenario played out in the last election. Hillary Clinton is a neoliberal whose promotion of trade policies and international policies has hurt working people in the United States. Trump comes along in a demagogic way and claims to have a program to put people back to work, to create better jobs, and playing on white supremacist racism in identifying the enemy not as the banks and the corporations that cause all our problems, but immigrants and Muslims and the black community and so on. So the tragedy in Eastern Europe is that the left has not been able to project an alternative economic program that is both anti-racist and pro-working class. Mm-hmm. And that's the same problem that we have here in the United States. We have not been able, as the left, to develop that third alternative And if we don't, it will be swinging back and forth between the fascists and the neoliberals.
We'll have a situation very, very similar, and which is already developing. We have something very similar to what has developed in Ukraine. Now, Phil, we're gonna attempt to do one last question. We have just about run out of time, but I've been told by Mel that we're gonna go another minute or two. But I have a real heavy question for you that I would like you to attempt to try to get at in 1 minute, and that is that
What is the meaning of life?
Beth Johnson says that what ultimately is the alternative to U.S. influence in Eastern Europe through the collective security arrangement of NATO. She says that the Russian Federation is clearly attempting to secure a sphere of influence in that region through the Eurasia Economic Union in order to keep out Western trade and influence. And that in this process, Ukraine has been basically reduced to a semi-periphery status in the Western system. So is there any more potential for them in that status as opposed to what Russia would offer them? That is, you know, where are they now, the Ukrainians? You know, either periphery with the West, or a deeper relationship with Russia.
I think probably the only realistic way forward for them, which they're not going to take, is to try for some sort of political neutrality as a border state. But they're not going to do that. The U.S. is not going to let them do that. The U.S. wants it not just to exploit the country economically, but to use it as a staging ground for aggression against Russia. I think in most people's minds, Russia is still this great big aggressive bear that's dangerous and we should be afraid of. Russia's military budget is 7% of the combined military budgets of NATO countries. And if Russia were to get into a fight with one of the 29 NATO countries, the other 28 are contractually obligated to come to their aid. Russia is not the aggressor here. NATO has been moving steadily eastward, gobbling up country after country after country until it's right on the border with Russia. The United States military budget is larger than the next 8 largest militaries in the world, which includes Russia and China. So Russia is operating from a defensive position. Everything that they're doing at this point is to try to prevent themselves from being taken over by the West. They do military maneuvers, and we go, they're doing military maneuvers. They're on their own land. We do military maneuvers in Ukraine next to Russia.
Right.
So this is a difficult thing for people to grasp, because you know Russia is supposed to be so terrible, and if you say anything like maybe it's not so terrible, then they accuse you of being a Russian spy, and of course when someone like Trump, you know, adopts the position that maybe we shouldn't be so hostile to Russia, we have to scramble to distinguish our position from their position. You know, Russia is a capitalist country. If it were developed more, it might have its own imperialist designs, but it's in a very weakened position, and it's just trying to maintain its territorial integrity and its economic independence. That's my view. So whether it's a Barack Obama or a Donald Trump or a George Bush or a Bill Clinton, they're all going to do the same thing. They're going to try to extend U.S. hegemony, and we have to fight it no matter who's in the White House.
Well, you know, I think that for myself, my analysis of Trump's approach with the Russians was his naive and I think clumsy belief that he was going to be able to split the Russians off from the Chinese, because it seemed to me that his real objective, his real concern was more the Chinese than Russia. But of course, that was not in alignment with the agenda of the transnational bourgeoisie based primarily in the U.S. And so now, of course, because of his inability to communicate that he is in fact going to be a team player, and that undermined their money with the military-industrial complex, that they shouldn't be concerned that he's making noises about bringing back in Glass-Steagall. You know, but they are not going to take a chance. It's, like you said earlier, it's quite clear that, and I didn't believe this up until a few days ago, but it seems that they are in fact going to drive all the way toward impeachment. So it remains to be seen just how this is going to unfold. So Linda Lori wants to know, how do we fight all of this as citizens? You have 30 seconds to tell us how we're going to fight back, Phil.
You can't fight alone. You can't fight as a small group or a small network of groups. We have to mobilize millions. So come to Richmond, Virginia, June 16th, 17th, and 18th for the Stop the Wars at Home and Abroad conference sponsored by the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. Google UNAC Conference 2017.org. UNAC Conference 2017.org, joined with hundreds of activists from around the country and a half a dozen other countries so far in networking, educating, strategizing, theorizing, and coming up with an action proposal where we can begin to work together more as a movement and not as individual voices. Not just protest, but moving beyond protest to exerting actual real pressure on the economy, on the government, on the ruling class. UNAC Conference 2017.org. It's one way. I think it's the best shot we got.
Thank you so much, Phil. If people want to get directly in contact with you and the Virginia Defenders, how to do that?
Defenders, the name of the group is Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. So Defenders, FJE at gmail.com.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm being corrected. I don't usually write to us ourselves. Hotmail.com. Defenders, FJE at hotmail.com.
Fantastic. Phil, thank you so much for this very, very insightful conversation. Many of the comments we have more comments sometimes than questions, but the common theme has been a very informative conversation that we need to, in fact, bring you back, and we will, in fact, do that. Folks, as Phil said, go to that website, get that information. I will be in Richmond. As many of you know, we have started a new organization called the Black Alliance for Peace, which we see as part of the effort to revive the anti-war movement here in this country. This is the historic moment to do that. And we're going to come together, all of us, in Richmond, and we're going to strategize on how we, in fact, build a powerful people's movement to create a real democracy and to create societies in which we all can live as human beings and not be burdened with the scourge of war. So thank you, my friends, and join us again, please, next week, this time, 8 o'clock, next Thursday, for another conversation from a voice from the margins. Thank you and good night.